On today's show, friction brewing between Nuggets head coach Michael Malone and the Denver front office. Plus, will Jamal Murray be able to live up to his newest contract extension? It's all coming up on today's Locked On NBA.
You are Locked On NBA, your daily NBA podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up and welcome to another edition of Locked On NBA, the biggest stories with the local experts. I'm your host, Jackson Gatlin, also host of Locked On Rockets right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Now, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Look, you've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. We have something a little bit different for you today. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5. It's just $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. Then with a YouTube TV base plan, you'll be able to watch every regular season Sunday afternoon out-of-market game. All you need is a Google account and a current form of payment, and you're all set and you can cancel at any time. And if that's not enough, FanDuel also has something special for our listeners this weekend. Be sure to check out FanDuel's Profit Boost in the app and use it for FanDuel's Double Your Winnings for all of Sunday, September 8th pregame moneyline bets. Profit Boost will be live starting Friday, September 6th. Visit your account page now to learn more about your boost. Just visit FanDuel.com and download America's #1 sportsbook. Joining us now is the host of Locked On Nuggets and Locked On NBA, Matt Moore. You can track down wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube. Just search Locked On Nuggets. Now, Matt, last few days, ESPN's Zach Lowe kind of shared some insight that there were some quote-unquote rumblings, if you will, and he put emphasis on the word rumblings, that head coach Michael Malone and the front office of the Denver Nuggets aren't exactly seeing eye to eye on things right now as it stands. So I want to kind of dive into kind of just the speculation side of this thing, but then also just kind of the severity of it and kind of where this Nuggets team is headed, because you kind of look at where they were, right? One season removed or a couple seasons removed, whatever, how you want to look at it, from them being a title team, right? Winning the championship, and then, losing some significant pieces since that time. But it kind of feels like maybe the front office has this idea of like a two timelines philosophy maybe about it, with trying to develop and harbor some of the young talent on the roster. And maybe Michael Malone doesn't quite see it that way, with the fact that he wants to be in the best position to win right now.
Yeah, it's funny. It's kind of a sign of like how important it is to follow Locked On, whatever the team is, for all of your coverage. Because like we've been talking about this pretty openly for months. Like this is not any sort of secret or big. It was surprising to us that it made all these waves, because we're like, yeah, no, this is pretty obvious, guys. Like Michael Malone has not shied away from being like, yeah, no, we got a lot of young guys, which is not great if you're trying to win a title. And the front office being like, hey, new CBA, gotta have young guys in order to keep everything sustainable. So I think to a certain degree, it's probably now become a little bit overblown because they can work together. But look, when Calvin Booth took over, Michael Malone wasn't his hire. How many times in the NBA do we see that problem where a new executive comes in and the coach isn't his guy? They're not on the same wavelength. And then you throw in all the problems with this kind of two timelines thing. Now, the most interesting thing, I think, with the timeline stuff, with the young players, is the response this summer with them going out and adding Russell Westbrook and Dario Saric. And that Russell Westbrook specifically was a request, a player that Nikola Jokic wanted in Denver. Like that to me kind of illustrates that not only is there a disconnect between the front office and Michael Malone, but clearly, whether it's, I don't think Nikola Jokic is going to get involved in team building, but I don't think Nikola Jokic is like, yeah, no, surround me with a bunch of 20-year-olds while I'm trying to win a title. Sounds great. That's great idea. Love it. It's going to be awesome. And so I think that there's a little bit of tension there, and it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. Now, bear in mind, like some of this is just like the realities of how the NBA is being built, because you see the Bucks tried the opposite approach, which is, all right, we're not going to go young. We're going to go super old. We're going to bring in veterans on 1-year deals. And it's really hard to kind of keep yourself up and going if you're doing that. You run out of options. Like that's why you're trying to throw out there Jay Crowder and Wes Matthews at the end of their careers. And that's pretty tough from a sustainability standpoint. So it'll be interesting to see kind of like how Denver manages this. But I will just say, like, yeah, no, look, the team is built to win now. The ownership has said they're built to win now. And yet the front office is trying to make it to where it's a sustainable process for the CBA over the next 5-10 years. And ownership is like, we have to win now because we have Nikola Jokic. And then ownership is also like, oh yeah, no, we voted for this new CBA, which is basically a hard cap. So good luck. It's somehow, oh no, the consequences of my own actions. And that's kind of what's going on in Denver.
It feels so messy because I feel like we haven't quite seen a team really do the whole two timelines thing effectively yet, because it's such a tricky slope to get. Because obviously, yes, with the new CBA, you do need young, cheap talent to be able to kind of keep things going. Because if you do rely or over rely on the veterans, then yeah, you run into the problem that you illustrated with the Milwaukee Bucks. But you can go back even recently, the Warriors, right, tried the whole two timelines thing. They were like, okay, we've got all this young talent, we've got the number 2 overall pick, we're gonna buy in and do all this instead of kind of building up what they already had after that one down season. And they received a lot of flack for that. But I can't, and hopefully you can, illuminate us here. I don't know if were there any, I guess, missed opportunities by the Nuggets to either capitalize, at the trade deadline or even as recently as this past offseason to improve the roster, to add veteran help that they otherwise just, I don't want to say forewent. That's not the right word. Foregone? No, that's not the right word. I can't find the word for it, but that they skipped over, that they passed over, right? In favor of, I guess, being, cheap, if you want to call it that, by sticking with the young talent. Is there an example that you have for that? Or have they pretty much taken advantage of the opportunities that they've been given?
No, I mean, look, let's go back to last year, right? So the deadline comes, they're top 3 in the Western Conference. They have what is considered to be the best starting 5. And most people in the league at that point felt the Nuggets were going to win the championship again. Like that was kind of the consensus. And, they beat the Celtics in both games on the road and at home. And they kind of illustrate that they're the best in the league. They go 15-2 after the All-Star break, but push themselves too hard. And part of that is because they kept trying to go for the 1 seed instead of tailing back and getting themselves rested for the playoff run. They thought they could have their cake and eat it too. So they lose in 7 games. They win 57 games, tying a franchise record. They lose the 1 seed by a half game. They lose to the Wolves in the second round in game 7 after being up 20. And then they go in the offseason. And there is really kind of the question is, should they have kept KCP and then tried to move him in a trade later, rather than just trying to avoid the second apron? But the second apron, I think when we look around the league, there are teams that are legitimately concerned about it. And if you want the best proof of it, I think it's the Clippers. The Clippers basically being like, yeah, no, we'll just let Paul George walk. We're going to be worse. We're going to have our locker room leadership is now Kawhi Leonard and James Harden. And that's fine. From an ownership group that has always been like, hey, I do not care about how much money it takes. I want to win a championship. And even they were like, this is too restrictive. We have to kind of try and avoid this. And so whether teams are being too apprehensive now or not, the reality is that they are concerned about that flexibility. And there are reasons for it, where you look at the idea of if they kept KCP and they locked in this roster, if someone gets hurt, they have no flexibility. They can't add anybody. They can't add anybody on after the deadline in buyouts. They can't aggregate salary and trade.
The counter argument to that is if somebody gets hurt now, if somebody gets hurt, then you're just where you're at now, right? Because you lost KCP for nothing. So at least it feels like that would be a better place to be in. And that's where I think some of the frustration for a lot of Nuggets fans comes from with, you're wasting a 3-time MVP in his prime.
Right. Yeah. And you have the question is, do you want to have a worse roster, but more flexibility to improve, or a better one that's more fragile and no flexibility to improve? That was kind of the binary that they pitched as. I'm not sure if that was it. What this really honestly comes down to, Jackson, is the MPJ contract. Like that's like the root of all of this, is that the MPJ contract was signed under the previous CBA, where it's like, look, it's probably an overpay, but this is what you do. You pay to keep your guys, and it's fine because it's not like there's any sort of restriction outside of the luxury tax. It's fine if we overpay MPJ. And now what you have is you have a guy with multiple back injuries with a very narrow role who is very difficult to trade on the current contract. And that causes a lot of problems. So the reality of this is that if they were to struggle this season, we're going to see major changes with the Nuggets. Aaron Gordon is up next year. He's eligible for an extension at the end of the month. MPJ is eligible for an extension at the end of the month. He's up in 2 years. And if things go sideways, there's going to be major changes. That's what makes the Jamal Murray extension interesting, because it does kind of reposition it as there might be other pieces moving, but it's likely going to be Murray and Jokic for the duration, which does kind of change things. Look, I think that the Nuggets are worse now than they were last year, and they were worse last year than they were the year before when they won the title. but this is the new reality of the CBA. And the only way we're going to know whether their navigation of it was correct or not is by giving it time, because there's really no way to see how the CBA is going to change things for the rest of the teams in the NBA.
Really quickly, last thing before we get you out of here, Matt. You mentioned the Murray contract extension, so 4 years, $208 million for a guy who has been a little injury plagued throughout his career to this point. I mean, how do we think how do we think this contract ages? Is my question, because it's one of those where you have to do it. You can't not extend Murray. He's the second best player on your contending team. He is the Robin to Jokic's Batman, whatever you want to call it. But is that not a contract where 2 years that, like, we're going to be looking at it from, a couple years down the pipeline thinking, man, this contract could be really brutal for the Nuggets?
Yeah, it definitely could be. I mean, look, this is a guy that outside, like, let's look beyond the injuries, right? Because he suffered the ACL tear coming off of the shortened offseason after the bubble.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that was an extreme situation.
Yeah.
He recovers from that. It takes a full year. ACL tears are no longer this major thing with players. Most players get over them and return to form. And then last year, he had like a series of weird injuries, like shoulders and ribs and hips and different, and hamstring last season, where there are cause for concern with in terms of how his conditioning for keeping him out of injury situations. But I don't necessarily think that you look at Jamal Murray and go like, oh, he just cannot get over whatever, a knee injury. And so that's less of a concern for me. But I think the bigger problem is that he's never been an all-star, and he's had all these opportunities, and he plays next to Jokic, and he plays on a winning team, and he has all these high-profile showcase moments in the playoffs, and he's never been an all-star, and he's never been All-NBA. And at some point, you want him to make that jump. Now, he's become a better passer and a better player. And he's, obviously like a monster in the playoffs 2 years ago. He was also bad in these playoffs. And so the question is really up to Jamal. It's not a matter of whether this contract is going to age poorly because of whatever physical factors. It's whether or not Murray is going to be motivated enough to become it. Will Murray play to the level of his contract, or will he continue to kind of be like, as long as I turn it on in the playoffs, that's fine? Because that's too risky of a proposition, I think, for what the Nuggets are committing to him financially.
Will the friction between Nuggets head coach Michael Malone and the front office continue? How will the Nuggets look running things back as, honestly, a weaker team this season? You're going to have us covered for all of that and so much more over at Locked On Nuggets. Matt, thanks for stopping by Locked On NBA.
Thanks, Jackson.